Welcome to Longmont Public Library's presentation of Gardening Success, Growing Veggies. It's presented by the generosity of the Friends of the Longmont Public Library. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Boulder County Master Gardeners, Melissa Fuller and Patty Rhodes.
Thank you so much to the Longmont Library for having us, and thank you everybody for coming today. Hopefully we can answer some of your questions to help you have a successful vegetable garden this coming season. So my name is Melissa Fuller, and later Patty Rhodes will be talking to you as well. We are both Colorado Master Gardeners. All that means is that we've completed a 12-week course or so through the CSU extension to dive deep into our passion of gardening. So today we're going to try to help you have a successful vegetable garden. We're going to start with the basics of having a successful garden in Colorado, and then we're going to move into some common pitfalls that you might run into. So first things first, what do you want to grow? Right, that's the most exciting thing to think about when you're starting your vegetable garden. There's so many vegetables to choose from, and there's so many that that don't make it into our grocery shelves. So something I really like to do is expand my palette and my plate by growing different kinds of vegetables that you might not be able to find in the grocery store. So once you've decided on growing, let's say, tomatoes, then you can decide which kind of tomato you want to grow. Do you want to grow a plum, aroma, cherry, or grape? Each kind of cultivar has its own strengths and weaknesses. As you're starting out, sticking with the tried and true veggies like the tomatoes, leafy greens, green beans, things like that, those can be really beneficial to get you started. And then as you get more comfortable with those, you can branch out into some of these more exotic vegetables. So as you're thinking about what you'd like to grow, also think about the space that you're going to be growing in. Do you have enough light, enough room to grow? Do you have adequate soil and water? So we're going to touch on each of these in the coming slides. So first off is light. So when thinking about sunlight, consider the time of day that your garden is going to get sun and how much. So afternoon sun is hotter than morning sun, and it might be too intense for some of your leafy greens. Leafy greens can do okay in part sun or dappled light, but peppers, for example, love direct full sun exposure. And then of course, all veggies are going to need at least a few hours of direct sunlight to thrive. So before planting your garden, take notice of how much sun your space will get and when, so you can be sure that your plants get adequate light. Space is the next thing to consider. So these are just a few ideas of where you can do your vegetable gardening. Whichever you choose, just make sure that your space has enough room for your veggies to grow. There should be spacing instructions on the seed packet and the plant markers if you choose to use transplants to help guide you. But keeping in mind that if they're too close together, then they're competing for soil resources, sunlight, and water, all those things that veggies need to thrive. So it's tempting, especially in the beginning of the season, to try to squeeze a bunch of plants together. And it seems doable when they're so small, but keep in mind the long game here and have adequate spacing for your full-grown plants. Also when planting, keep in mind the ease of your space so that you can easily reach all the way across your bed to harvest and water. So to dive into more specifics with each kind of these spaces here, the garden bed, meaning that we're planting directly into the backyard soil, it's going to be less expensive up front and it's going to allow for easier expansion. But since you'll be planting directly into the soil, you may need to amend your soil more frequently. So it's a good idea to have your soil tested. We're going to talk a lot more about that to find out what kind of amendments your soil needs. Both garden beds and raised beds are great if you need more space, like if you're planting squash or cucumbers or beans, or you can add trellises if you want them to kind of grow more vertically so you can have more space. You can kind of get creative in that way. For using raised beds, it's going to have a higher upfront cost, obviously, because you're going to need to have the wood and import some dirt, some soil there for you. And there's some advantages to having raised beds. So you're going to have better soil quality just because you're getting purchased soil. And that's going to reduce your soil compaction, and you're going to have established walkways. Most people don't walk on their raised beds. You can also plant earlier because there's better drainage, and it allows the soil to warm quicker in the spring. And then it's easier to cover for spring and fall frost protection, or like shade in the summertime if you're trying to protect your delicate vegetables. You can also concentrate your soil improvement in a defined area, which is kind of nice. Containers is another thing that you can think about and a place to plant your vegetables. Just keep in mind that not all vegetables thrive in a confined space. So tomatoes and peppers do pretty well in pots, but melons and squash don't do so well in a confined space. Also keep in mind that with containers, it's going to have different watering needs, temperature, and soil oxygen circulation with your potted plants, just because of the nature of being in a pot and not having that natural drainage. But the good things are that pots are mobile, so you can put them on your patio or your porch. You can also fill it with a specific kind of soil if there's something specific that you want to grow that doesn't thrive in our alkaline clay Colorado soil. Half barrels are good if you need more space. Just be sure to fill them, have them where you want them before you fill them with soil. Window boxes are also good for certain shallow rooted veggies and herbs. So just keep those in mind and do what makes sense for your space, time, and finances. I'll spend the next couple of minutes talking about soil because soil is such a hot topic these days, and knowing what kind of soil you have will greatly improve your understanding and really help your garden thrive. The easiest way to know the makeup of your soil is to get a soil test. That can be done through the CSU extension. We have the website listed here on this slide. It's the soiltestinglab.colorado.edu. It's just a small fee, and they'll tell you what kind of soil you have and what your nutrient ratios are. So you're not adding more of something that you already have enough of, excuse me. You can take a sample at any point during the year, although most people like to do it in the spring or the fall just to help them prepare for the gardening season. And you'll want to avoid sending a sample within 30 days of adding any kind of soil amendment. At this time, I would recommend calling ahead to see what their turnaround time is. They are only taking samples via mail right now, so sooner rather than later will probably be better for you. And because it is just going through the mail, you're just going to send a quart-sized baggie instead of a glass jar like we used to do. All right, so digging into soil a little deeper, no pun intended. It's super important part of having a successful garden. I'm sure you know that soil and dirt are not the same thing. So native soil is a living, self-sustaining ecosystem, and in Colorado, we tend to have a mostly clay, although sometimes it can be sandy soils. And we tend to have low organic matter, and organic matter is the part that makes dirt soil. So Colorado soils tend to be alkaline as well, meaning they have a higher pH, which does matter to some plants, so keep that in mind. And unfortunately, you can't change the texture or the pH of your soil. But you can still work with your clay soil if you choose to use our native soils. Just keep adding organic matter on a routine basis to help foster those microorganisms and promote earthworms. And the earthworms help to create some of those porous spaces in the soil. If your soil is more clay, just know that it has a higher tendency for soil compaction, water retention, so it's going to drain a lot slower, and you're going to hold on to nutrients longer, including salt, which most plants don't like a highly salted soil. It's also going to be slower to warm in the spring. Of course, if your soil is more on the sandy side of things, you're going to have the opposite. So you are going to have a lower potential for compaction, low water nutrient holding, and quicker to warm in the spring. Your ideal soil type is going to be loam, which you can purchase and you can achieve with a raised bed. You can add soil amendments to help your soil out, but like I said, you can't really change the texture of your soil. So if you have clay now, you're always going to have clay. But most of us don't really garden in native soil because we live in neighborhoods that have landscape soils brought in, and then gigantic trucks and things have driven over it that compacts it. So a very important part of soil is oxygen and the space for that oxygen to travel to the roots. So a very common reason for plants to fail is low soil oxygen and soil compaction. To avoid soil compaction, just avoid walking on your garden beds. Avoid unnecessary rototilling because it destroys that soil structure, and then add mulch and organic matter. And then some common mistakes that gardeners make is working the soil when it's wet. We don't want to do that because it leads to soil compaction. We also like to add more fertilizer and too much organic matter. And I know I keep saying add organic matter, but you want to make sure that you're doing it in ratio with what actually needs to do. So pardon me if I sound like a broken record, but a soil test is a really great way to keep that in check. And then people also inadvertently create a texture interface, and that happens more frequently with a raised bed because what people do is they'll add different types of soils into their raised beds, and it creates different textures that the water can't really trickle through effectively. So if you are gardening in a raised bed especially, try to get more consistent soil texture and then mix them together so you don't create those texture interfaces. And then I just really liked this picture. I thought it was so cute. It applies to humans and plants, but just keep in mind that there's so much that's going on beneath the surface too, even if you're not seeing the results above ground. So patience is great medicine sometimes. So when I talk about soil amendments, what I'm talking about is anything that is mixed into the soil. Sometimes people think of compost as feeding the soil, and then fertilizers are feeding the plants. So when looking at fertilizers, you're going to notice that they list an NPK ratio. You've probably seen that in the garden stores. And so the N stands for nitrogen, and that's often a very limiting factor to plant growth. The amount needed is plant dependent though, and it needs to be in ratio with other nutrients. So for example, some of your vine crops, they're going to make more vine and no fruit. There's too much nitrogen. But things like corn, potatoes, and broccoli, they're more heavy feeders, and so they want a lot of nitrogen. Low nitrogen, you might see yellowish leaves, you might see small thin leaves. And the best way to know for sure is, of course, a soil test. P stands for phosphorus, and that's needed for your root growth. It's most likely to be deficient in new gardens that have low organic matter or a high pH. And then K stands for potassium or potash, and that's needed for blossoms. And it's, again, most likely to be deficient in new garden beds with low organic matter or in sandy soils. Also know that too much potassium can lead to a salt problem. So some good ways to get some organic matter into your soils could be fall leaves or untreated grass clippings. Those can be mixed into your soils. Manure is also good, but it should be aged for about a year before you till it in because it's high in salt and microbes. So obviously never put fresh manure on your veggies, okay? You can turn it in the fall, let it compost over winter, but again, nothing fresh on your edibles there. Good to know is that backyard and commercial composts are not regulated, so they might be high in salt. It's not a big deal at first, but as you grow your garden, these things can accumulate and it can be an issue for your plants. So as you get your garden started for the first year or two, incorporate your soil amendment into the first or the top 6 to 8 inches of your garden. This will help facilitate some deep root growth. And then as your garden becomes more mature, then you can just you can decrease the amount of soil amendment that you're adding. Cover crops are also great, especially with our clay soils, because their deep roots can break up some of the compaction. So you can grow these in fall or early spring, and then you till them into the soil, and it helps to get some really good organic matter in there. I would also recommend rotating your crops the best that you can during one growing season to the next growing season, even if it's just from one side of the garden bed to the other. Different crops use different nutrients, and they also attract different diseases and bugs, so switching things up can decrease those issues. When talking about soil testing, it's also a good idea to get that checked every 4 to 5 years if you haven't added any serious amendments. But if it's a new bed, then I would suggest doing it annually. I would also suggest getting your raised beds tested just like your native beds, because they're, like I said, they're not regulated. So, you know, you want to test those just like anything else. Now, soil temperature wasn't really something that I had ever thought about until I became a master gardener, but soil temperature is what actually drives seed germination. So gardening in Colorado, as we know, can be a bit of a challenge with our weather. We've got a shorter growing season, and we have some pretty extreme temperature. But knowing when to plant is really important for having a successful vegetable garden. So good to know is that cool season crops germinate at a temperature of about 40 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and warm season crops are about 50 to 90 degrees. So why that's important is if soil temperatures are too cold, then a warm season crop will be stunted. And if soil temperatures are too warm, then a cool season vegetable may bolt, meaning that it produces those seeds to reproduce before the crop is harvested. They may also not flower, or they may drop their blossoms. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Patty. She's going to talk to you about watering in Colorado. There we go.
Here we go. Okay, sorry about that. The first thing that I want to talk about is water, and the fact that it takes a real commitment to tend a veggie garden, and watering is such a big part of it. The watering in Colorado can be really tough because you need to figure out exactly how much is right for your garden. Soil organisms that Melissa had talked about require an environment that's damp, along the lines of a wrung out sponge, but not soggy. Over irrigation will bring waterlogged soil, which is harmful to soil organisms and provides no movement of oxygen. But if the soil's too dry, the soil organism activity can be reduced, which you don't want either. You can water traditional garden beds and raised beds by hand, but the better way is to have an irrigation system in place. You can use drip lines, which are a type of very small sprinkler system. It's got little discs on it where the water is kind of flung out like a regular sprinkler, but it's low to the ground and lateral water movement to get to the base of the plants. Using a drip line can reduce your water usage by about 50%. Soaker hoses with timers are inexpensive and easy to use, and they help keep your garden watered wisely. They let water seep out slowly along its length, which is perfect for crops that need uniform coverage along the row. And the picture that I have here on this slide is of a soaker hose. You can see how it's just widening out to make sure the plants are watered where they need to be watered. And if you're gardening in containers, the watering can be really easy. You can just use a hose, a pitcher, or a watering can, but you want to make sure you water at the instead of overhead. On the next slide, we'll talk about mulch. A mulch is something that goes on and temperature and add organic matter. It also helps to prevent soil compaction and protects your soil oxygen levels. It also helps control weeds, conserve water, even more so if you're using a drip line or a soaker hose, you should cover that in mulch as well. It will moderate the soil temperature and has a direct impact on soil microorganism activity. We recommend soft mulches like grass clippings that haven't had applied. Straw is also great for vegetable gardens. They break down quickly and are one means for controlling disease. Fresh grass clippings should be applied in thin layers up to 1/4 inch thick and allowed to dry before adding more. And in the fall, which this is a great thing about the grass clippings, you simply cultivate the grass back into the soil, and that will provide small amounts of organic matter. Straw is great too, but you need to be sure to look for certified weed seed, same as the seed, free products. Otherwise, you'll find your garden sprouting oats. The straw is also a good organic source for clayey soils, and you can cultivate that into the soil as well. You do want to steer away from wood chips or rock mulch. They don't break down quickly, they're very hard to remove, and it can take several years for chips to decompose. The next thing I want to talk about is weeds in your garden. One of the many definitions that I've seen and heard over the years is that weeds are plants growing where you don't want them. So dandelions, I know some people love dandelions in their yard and they're okay in their gardens, but you might not want to mess with them because they can compete for space, water, nutrients, and light that you want your vegetables to have. Something we call an integrated weed management system can help you keep weeds in check. It incorporates cultural, mechanical, biological, and chemical methods. And the idea here is to start with the one that will get the job done with the least impact to the environment. The cultural portion is the first one that will give you the best job with the least, with the least impact to the environment. Cultural is things like mulching to prevent light from getting to weed seedlings. It keeps your vegetables healthy and lets them better compete and crowd out weeds. A mechanical means can be hand pulling or using a hoe or a cultivator. Hand pulling is the safest and most practical way to control established weeds. And you want to be sure if you do this that you get the entire root system. If you have your soil slightly moist, it makes it less likely for the long roots to snap off. Cutting off weeds at soil level with a hoe or cultivator is less work, but it's really not as effective as hand pulling because, of course, you're not getting the big roots out. And biological solutions are chemicals. No, I'm sorry. Biological solutions are things like insects, basically. And with few exceptions, biological solutions do not exist for common weeds. And chemical methods, which are herbicides, should only be used when all other methods have failed or proved impractical. So if you stay on top of weeding and never let your weeds go to seed, you'll eventually keep weeds from returning, at least in large numbers. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is whether to do direct sowing or transplants. And it just depends on how much you want to put into the whole process of gardening. There are advantages and disadvantages to direct sowing, and there are advantages and disadvantages to transplants. Some vegetables are easier to grow when the seeds are planted or sowed directly in your soil. Common things that are really good for direct sow are lettuce and other leafy greens. Radishes do well with that. Let me think, beans do really well with that. They'll grow like crazy. Some vegetables are best when they're grown from seed indoors or in a greenhouse. Some people refer to transplants as starts, but in both cases, you're planting vegetables that either you have started or have been started for you. Let's talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of direct sowing. Tap-rooted crops, which is an advantage of direct sowing, are ones that have a large central dominant root from which other roots sprout. Some examples of tap-rooted crops are carrots, radishes, beets, turnips, and parsnips. And believe it or not, spinach and lettuce are also tap-rooted crops. It just doesn't seem like they would have that, but they are tap-rooted. Direct sow vegetables grow faster, and they produce well even in Colorado's shorter growing season. Direct sowing is less labor intensive than starting plants indoors or in a greenhouse. Our growing season and climate can vary wildly, as you know, but the average season length for the period from 2009 to 2019 is 124 days, which is just a little more than 4 months, so really not all that long. The average last frost date was May 31st, with the first frost date of October 2nd. So because of our shorter growing season and climate, you want to choose vegetables to direct sow that have fewer days to germination and shorter maturity periods. This information is easily found on seed packets. One example is spinach, which is a cold, hardy vegetable, can be planted in early spring and fall and is mature in about 45 days. When the seeds begin to germinate, they need to be thinned so the plants aren't clumped together as they mature. And thinning them out will allow the strongest ones to survive. Now, transplants. I use transplants for certain vegetables like tomatoes. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. If you're starting tomato transplants indoors, your seeds, that you're putting them in little cups, or you have a full setup for growing your transplants, you can effectively control the climate. However, there is a cost associated with purchasing the items needed to grow them, and it can be expensive. You can find little shortcuts, but overall, you're going to need to put out some outlay for that. The starts require more labor and skills as opposed to direct sowing, where you plant the seed directly in your growing space. But there's more efficiency with seed and resources. Whereas there's generally more thinning when you direct sow, there's less with growing your own transplants. And that's because you're growing in them small little containers, and so you only put 1 or 2 seeds in each container. But there's also talking about if you are putting a lot, you have like a big garden where you're going to put, 10, 20 tomato plants out. You really, in my mind, I like transplants because I don't have the room to do my own seeds inside the house. I don't have a greenhouse, and my garden isn't so big that I see the value in growing 3 tomato plants, which is about what I can put in my garden and still have room for some other items like peppers. And so one of the best reasons to work with transplants is season extension. Tomatoes, again, are a perfect example of when you'd want to either start your own, or even easier, to purchase the starts from a nursery to plant in your garden. When you use transplants, the plants are getting a head start on producing fruit because the seeds take from 6 to 8 weeks to germinate before you want to put them in the ground. The final point I want to make on no, it's not the final point actually, but the next point I want to make is that there are things that you need to look for when you're buying the ideal transplant. Thick, sturdy stem, dark colored thick leaves, pencil diameter for the stalk. You want them to be between 6 to 8 inches tall. Make sure they're free of disease and insects, and you don't want them to be flowering. That sounds odd because you'd think it would give you a head start on your fruit being produced. But if you have blossoms on your plant, they'll develop and then set fruit before the plant is even mature. That makes the plant expend all its energies on producing the fruits at the expense of establishing a strong plant that will be able to produce many more tomatoes. You want to avoid any plants that have been neglected and use caution when you buy transplants after a cold, wet spring. Also, avoid tall, thin, and pale plants that have not received enough sun or water. And the very last thing that I want to mention about transplants is how important it is to help them make that transition, even if you buy them from a nursery or if you have grown them yourself. They need to be exposed to the outdoor conditions before you put them in your garden space. So a recommendation is to buy your transplants at least a week before planting. You put them out in the shade in a protective spot to start for a few hours each day. By about the third day, you should keep them outdoors for 6 to 8 hours. The fourth day, outdoors when it warms up, and then you bring them back inside as the sun dips. On the fifth day, you put them outside when it warms up and then bring them in after dinner, 5 or 6 o'clock. On the sixth day, outdoors when it warms up and inside before bedtime, or just later than what you did the day before. And then you want to leave them outdoors all night. After you've done that, they should be ready to put into your garden. So go ahead and plant the plant. Now, if you are doing whether you're doing direct or transplants, there is a lot to look at, a lot of information that you can find from reading a seed packet. And I've put some examples of seed packets in this presentation. There's the next slide would be carrot, then spinach, and then peppermint chard. So as you can see on here, the front of the packet tells you the type of seed and the variety. These are carrots. They're Danvers Half Long, which is an heirloom variety. And it tells you something that you might be really interested in right off the bat if you don't have a lot of room for a garden, which is that these are perfect for containers because they're not as long as a normal carrot, the kind that you buy up at the supermarket where they're 10 inches long. On the back of the packet, you'll see a description of the half-long carrot. It's sweet and crunchy. It's dark orange. It's fine-grained. It's smoother than some carrot varieties and not as long. It's easy to grow. It stores well, and it stays crisp when you cook it. They're perfect for deep containers and shallow gardens. It also includes information about when to plant and preparing the soil for the seeds before you plant. I like the suggestion on here about mixing your soil up. You want to loosen it to a depth of about 8 inches so that the taproot will grow straight. If you don't have it in there, if you don't allow it enough room to grow straight, believe me, the first time I grew carrots, they came out really kind of funky looking because they'll hit the bottom of whatever that bottom layer of soil is, and they have no more room to grow straight. And the strip on the back, which you can see on the left-hand side on the picture here, has the seed depth, the plant space, the row space, the sprout time, maturity, and how many seeds are in the packet. For spinach, the packet of seeds has the same type of information, but a different look. This hybrid spinach is non-GMO, but it's not organic. It's also slow to bolt, which is a great thing for any vegetable. Bolting is when a plant basically goes to seed. It's a fast-growing leafy vegetable, prefers cooler season. If it gets too hot, that's when it starts to bolt. And when that happens, your spinach gets bitter and it can be stringy. On this particular, oh, where's the other picture? Oh, it doesn't show it, but on the front of this packet, you can see the picture of the spinach, and this one has smoother leaves and they're so much easier to clean than the ones that are heavily wrinkled. But it's all a matter of taste. There are so many varieties of these. And again, on the back, you can see that it has the same type of information as the one we saw for carrots, but it's just laid out a little differently. Probably, for me at least, that's a little easier to read. The next packet, and the last packet that I'll show you about seeds. There we go. This is from a mail order catalog or a mail order seed company called Gurney's. They do not put pictures on their seeds. When you see the pictures on the seeds when you go online to order them. So the front of this is just bare bones. The back will tell you more about how you want to plant these, how you care for them, and when you harvest. When I buy seeds online and they have this information like this, I honestly, it's a little hack I have where I take a marker, a highlighter, and I highlight over the areas that I need to know right away. Like I know that I want to plant that seed 1 inch deep and 4 inches apart, and the rows between this peppermint chard need to be 18 inches apart. Same thing down in care. I know that when they're going to be ready to be thinned at 3 to 4 inches tall, and the harvest, it tells you when to do that. Interesting to note, and you can do this with any seed packet, but when you buy online, they give you a whole lot of information about even how to prepare these to eat, which I think is really nice. And they'll give you other information that is simply not enough room, but not really necessary to be on the packet. The next thing that I want to talk about is garden pests, the bane of every gardener's existence. To prevent, well, I'll start with saying that they're more of an aesthetic nuisance than a real threat to crop yield, but meaning that they make your plants look not so pretty like you see from, a big agricultural farm where there's no bug bites or anything. It's kind of funny, when I first started doing my vegetable garden, I pulled out a head of lettuce and I'm like, oh man, it doesn't look real pretty like the ones that I get in the grocery store. Well, that's because, there's some wear and tear. You can get a few bites here and there. So, you pull off the leaves, you rinse them off, and it's actually tastes better than what you buy in the store. So it's really a matter of what is acceptable to you. Obviously, you don't want these pests munching away on your plants until there's nothing left for you to harvest. There are some insects that can do real damage to crops, though. So if you notice a pest problem, you want to identify the plant and the pest as best as you can so you can deal with it correctly and manage the problem. And again, like with weeds, there is a way to manage the problems with the least hazards to health and environment. With weeds, we had integrated weed management, and the principles are the same for pests, but it's called integrated pest management. With cultural pest management, that's keeping the plant healthy with the proper irrigation, mulching, and pruning. Mechanical means setting traps and installing row covers to keep your plants protected. And there's so many different kinds of those. You can go online or look in catalogs to see the different kinds of covers you can put over the plants to help. I have a little bit of a problem with squirrels, and so I put little row covers over those plants that they seem to like the best. Biological is encouraging predators and parasites or directly releasing them into your garden. This usually causes the least harm to beneficial insects and the environment. For chemical means, whether it's organic or synthetic, pesticides require great care and should be the last resort. In order to ensure safety and effectiveness, it's important to read all the labels and follow the application instructions very carefully. Now, I'm not going to have time to talk about a lot of garden pests, but 3 of the most common ones are aphids. And the best way to control those usually is just give them a good blast of water on the top and underneath the leaves and on the stems. And sometimes that's all you need to do to control those. You might need to do it more than once, but it's pretty easy to get the hose out and just spray them off. They'll stop eventually. Beneficial insects, which is a biological method of control, can also be effective. Flea beetles are just about what they sound like. They're very tiny, they look like fleas, and as soon as they feel any movement whatsoever, they hop off when they're disturbed. Larger plants can typically withstand a mild flea beetle infestation even without IPM principles, but seedlings and small plants can easily die or have their growth stunted. You can use mechanical methods to take care of this. For example, row covers, and you can use the cultural methods such as planting a trap crop like radishes to lure flea beetles from your desirable plants. They'll go for the growth on top for the radishes. And Japanese beetles, can't talk about a garden without talking about garden. Japanese beetles, they are voracious eaters. They love beans, grapes, berries, and more, and pretty much every part of them, the leaves, the flowers, and the fruit. The most effective way to control beetles is cultural. You can hand pick or brush them into a container of soapy water early in the morning when they're more sluggish. You can also plant trap crops that will attract the beetles from your more desirable plants. But remember, you still have to kill the beetles even on the trap crops that you plant. And another thing that gardeners have to consider is battling with Mother Nature. Some of the top battles would be for drought, heat, frost, and hail. But you just have to do the best you can with this. Mother Nature pretty much charts her course, and we have to deal with what she throws our way. If you're in a drought situation, an adequate supply of water during the growing season is directly related to producing high quality and yields. During a drought, vegetables do not go dormant to save themselves like a perennial, for example. So they cannot preserve nutrients like a landscape plant does. Several techniques that help reduce the water requirements of your garden during a drought are to amend the garden soil with coarse, decomposed organic matter. You would want to practice efficient irrigation with soaker hoses or drip line with a timer. You can check the moisture regularly. And to do that, you can buy moisture checkers at most hardware stores, or you can simply get a good handful of the soil in your hand to irrigate again. If I can't emphasize enough about how great mulch is, and that's something you want to do when you're putting in a vegetable garden. A drought is limited to every 2 to 3 days. If you have good soil, organic content, your garden should be able to go about 2 to 7 days between irrigation. That we talk about amending, effective irrigation, moisture, and mulching. And if you're in a drought situation where no watering is allowed, just don't even plant a vegetable garden in a garden bed or a raised bed. At that point, you should consider planting some of your veggies in containers instead. Providing shade for your garden reduces evaporation of moisture from the soil, which is something that we absolutely have to think about here in Colorado when we have those temperatures in the 90s. Will eat like tomatoes. They will not set fruit in high temperatures, and peas, lettuces, and broccolis will bolt. You want to be able to provide shade with a shade barrier cloth that will cut sunlight by approximately 25%. You can make a shade canopy over the plants before the high heat of summer arrives, and then you can just place the cloth over heat-sensitive plants when the temperatures soar into the upper 80s. But they're worth what you pay for those. They come in different barrier percentages, but 25% is probably the better one. You don't want to do like 50 in your plants. It's a little bit too cool in some cases. For frost, there are a lot of ways to protect your plants. Some of the most common methods are blankets and sheets. Yes, they really work, but only if the fabric remains dry. If it absorbs water, the evaporative cooling can lead to colder temperatures adjacent to the blanket. After you've recharged, or you need to recharge the heat that's stored in the soil by removing any blankets and sheets during the daytime. Floating row covers is another way to protect from frost. That is a lightweight fabric that you lay directly over the crops, and it has like it's almost like a little tent rounded. They can provide protection over an extended period of time and don't have to be removed. And then you can also use clear plastic covering on a frame. The plastic has to be held up off the plants because if it touches them, they will freeze wherever the plastic touches them. And hail. There's really not a lot you can do to prevent damage, but you can try to minimize it. Ideally, you want to have your plants protected before the storm hits, and that can be hard to predict, but certain weather patterns can give you a clue. Hail cloth can be purchased in local garden centers, another thing that's well worth investing in. It's a tightly woven cloth that allows sunlight through, but it's really tough enough for to repel any hail that you get. So for younger plants, you can consider temporary protections while the plants get started. Something called a wall of water is a cone-shaped ring of connected plastic tubes that you fill with water, and it surrounds a single plant, like tomatoes, peppers, or summer squash. If you're growing a really big garden, that's a lot of walls of water. So let's talk a little bit about plant selection now. I've picked just a few crops that are really popular to grow in Colorado. The first one is beans. Bush beans, there are different types of beans, just like there are different types of tomatoes and carrots and any other vegetable. Some basic information about those, that they're relatively easy to grow. And I'll talk a little bit first about bush beans. They are what are known as a determinate crop, which means that they'll produce beans for a few weeks. Once they get mature, they'll produce for a few weeks and boom, then they're done. But you can plant more as a fall crop. These are compact little bush-like plants, and they do not need to be staked. Pole beans, by the opposite, continue to produce throughout the season until the nighttime temperatures consistently dip into the low 50s. They do need to be trellised to accommodate their height. They can grow to be more than 5 to 6 feet. Another, I haven't done this because I don't have the right place for it, but you can also grow pole beans along a fence. They just have to be trained to go into the holes of the fence. You could probably also do that with a trellis up against a wooden fence. It just depends on how much space you have and what you want to do in your garden. Beans need to have consistent soil moisture, or they will not develop fruit, the bean itself. They can use about 1 inch per week, more if it's unusually hot and dry. If your beans stop flowering, or if the buds drop without forming fruit, it's usually because it's too hot. They will pick up again when the temperature cools down. And last, leafy vegetables. These are your spinaches and lettuce primarily. You can plant those in mid to late summer to produce exceptional harvest quality during cool fall weather. You can also plant lettuces in mid-fall for extra early spring crops. You just need to, if you're going to do that for the early spring crops, you just have to cover the small seedlings with organic mulch so they're protected over the winter time. You need to keep the soil moist with 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week, including rain. If the crop gets dry, it will become tough and stringy and bolt. Okay, one of my favorite vegetables, because in my mind, there's nothing that beats the taste of a fresh homegrown tomato. Even though, as I said a little earlier, just about any vegetable that you grow just tastes better when you pop it out of the garden and you go in and eat it fresh. But tomatoes are one of the most popular groups for home gardeners. And you can grow them successfully with just a little know-how and the right care. Tomatoes also come in 2 types of tomato vines, determinate and indeterminate. The determinate tomatoes are more common for commercial production. The vine stops growing once flowering begins, and they produce a large single crop. They're typically moderate in size, and they're great for containers if you don't have room for the larger ones. But the most popular for home gardens are indeterminates. The vines will grow and produce throughout the season until frost kills the vine. The plants are typically large, and they require stakes or cages to support them. They need nighttime temperatures above 32 degrees Fahrenheit and daytime temperatures above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Tomatoes can be killed by a light frost, so that's something, when you hear about frost coming, you definitely want to get your tomatoes covered. Just a single week of cool daytime temperatures below 55 degrees will stunt the growth and will reduce the yield. Typically, in the Colorado Front Range, the time for planting tomatoes is about late May. The soil temperatures are warmer then, and you don't want to plant tomatoes during a cold spell. So that's just the general rule of thumb. Consistent watering is a must for tomatoes. If you don't water them consistently, you get nutrition deficiencies, diseases, issues with the fruit, and just overall poor plant care. Right.
Hey, Patty, I just want
Yeah.
to let you know that it's just a couple minutes before 8, just to let you know for your own time.
Okay. Let's skip over that. Let's go to the next one then. That's a lot of general information about tomatoes. And so the last thing, or next to the last thing that I want to talk about is this great program that the CSU Extension sponsors. They started it last year. It's called Grow and Give. Some people on this call may have even participated in this last year, and it's rolling out again for 2021. You can go to growandgivecolorado.org to find out more information and to register for the program if you're interested in doing that. It's really great. And the idea, of course, is to grow food in your garden and contribute whatever you don't need to eat to people who do. And the size of your garden doesn't matter. It's just your intent to help provide food to people in need in the community. And on the last slide, I just want to let you know about this free webinar that will be held on April 10th, Gardening in Raised Beds by Boulder County CMG Julie. You can register at the Colorado Master Gardeners Boulder County Facebook page or email Carol O'Meara at COMEARA@bouldercounty.org, and she will send you the link. And we really would like to thank you for taking part in this presentation and hope that you learn to start and what you need to learn to start and nurture your vegetable garden. All of this information and in more detail can be found on the CSU Extension website at cmg.extension.colostate.edu. And you can keep in touch with us by sending emails to the Colorado Master Gardener Help Desk at mggpa@bouldercounty.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patty and Melissa. It is 8:01. Do you have a couple minutes for some questions?
Yeah, we can take a few.
All right, great. I'm going to go in order here. Can you give us more information on a cover crop?
Yeah, gosh, we could do an entire webinar on cover crops. Those would be, you know, like you can have some peas or vetch or things like that. You can buy them just from any kind of seed store, like online seed company. They're sold as cover crops. You put them on, you know, after your harvest is done, a couple weeks before the frost, perhaps. And some of them are really great. They can germinate even in cooler soil temperatures, and they'll kind of go through the winter.
Thank you. Is commercial compost okay?
It is okay, but just know that it's not regulated. So feel free to use it. I use it, but that you don't know exactly what you're putting in your garden. So that's why it's good to keep that in check and get a soil test time to time.
Are grass clippings okay to use as mulch on garden if you're using organolawn for yard fertilizing?
Before you use grass clippings in your vegetable bed, you want to be sure, I mean, you can use grass clippings that have been sprayed with any kind of herbicides, that type of thing, but you really should wait for 30 days before you do that, regardless of what's sprayed on there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
For growing starters at home, how early would you start the seedlings indoors for Colorado transplants?
Well, on the other side, if you know, on the back side of a seed packet, it tells you when you need to do start inside seeds. Like tomatoes are generally 6 to 8 weeks before you want to plant. You kind of count back. We talked about tomatoes growing in Colorado, getting them in the ground about May 31st. So count back 6 to 8 weeks from that. And that's when you want to get your seeds started in your indoors or in a greenhouse. And it can vary for different vegetables. I'm just using tomatoes as the example.
Thanks. And then
Sure.
I'm going to go out of order because I got two questions about this. How would you recommend avoiding blossom end rot?
Blossom end rot is caused, or actually heat. Last summer, we saw a lot of that because we had consistently high temperatures on, wow, it was a few weeks where we were reaching over 90. And as most people think they are warm weather, they have the limit. So that is a perfect example of when you would want to use a shade cloth to keep them out of the direct sunlight when the heat is just brutal. And blossom end rot, is this person obviously knows, is a brown spot on the end of the tomato, on the flower end of the tomato, and it can spread through the whole tomato and just make them unedible. But if you catch it early enough, I mean, I've been able to slice off the very end and they're still fine, but you don't want it to happen to your tomatoes. And that's an easy way to fix it with the shade cloth.
Thank you. Now, compared to commercial fertilizers, when applying backyard compost or worm compost, is it possible to overdo it? How much would you apply during a season?
Yeah, I would say that it is still possible to overdo it. But again, like if you're doing a periodic soil test, then you're going to know what your soil needs. But your backyard soil can accumulate the micronutrients and the salt, just like the commercial compost. So I would still use the same guidelines as far as with a new bed, doing incorporating it into the top 6 to 8 inches, and then you can slowly taper off after that. You can also do side dressings and stuff, putting like scratching the soil surface around your plants and putting some compost around there if you already have mature plants growing. But for sure, use your backyard compost and your worm compost. Those are awesome.
Okay, I got just a couple more. For growing starters at home, how early would you start the seedlings indoor for Colorado transplants?
That is very similar to one that I answered a little earlier, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I asked it twice.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to be sure I didn't understand the first one and that I should go back and re-answer.
Yeah, sorry about that. How about, do you cut off buds when transplants are young?
I do.
Well, I do. Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I do, just because it puts the energy back into the roots. If you're transplanting a plant, then you want that energy to go into the roots and establishing a good root bed for your plants, instead of if you don't pinch off those blossoms, then the plant's going to put the energy into creating fruit instead of creating roots. So I would give it a week or so before you let it flower again.
All right. And finally, is there a good way to prevent powdery mildew before it starts?
I would just say spacing. That's my best. Patty, tell me if you have any other ideas, but that's what I would say, is just having adequate spacing so that you have good air circulation around your. Usually it's seen on squash and things like that, but it really is just the bane of our existence.
And watering too, just again with making sure that consistent watering is a raising thing for your gardens. And Melissa raised
Thank you.
about the spacing. I mean, really pay attention to that on the seed packets or on the little sticks if you buy the transplants from a nursery. Tomatoes need like 18 to 24 inches between plants, technically. I've seen them grouped in further, but the further apart you can get them when they reach full growth, or the full size, the better they're going to be.
All right, thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for your questions and for hosting us very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so very much. We really, really do appreciate you being available for questions and information. And once again, this was provided by the Friends of the Longmont Library. I'm Denise, and with me was Johannes, who is taking questions, and Sheena also has been helping out behind the scenes. We're all employees of the library. Again, if you have any other questions or information, feel free to contact the Boulder County Master Gardeners. If you have any questions about anything we're doing at the library, you have some options through Text a Librarian, Ask a Librarian. You can call us, you can email us. And we'd be happy to get you in touch with more resources or information if you need. So we appreciate you all for coming tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.